Welcome to The Conscious Entrepreneur, the only podcast 100% dedicated to the well-being of entrepreneurs. It's where founders come to sharpen their edge from the inside out and lead with clarity, connection, and purpose, without buying into hustle culture or burning out. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss an episode. Let's get started. So welcome, Jennifer Kinning, to the Conscious Entrepreneur podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
I'm grateful to be here and excited for the conversation ahead.
Excellent. For those of you who are listening, I'm super happy to introduce Jennifer Kinning. Jennifer is the co-founder of Align Impact, which is a registered investment advising company, an RIA. And what she does and what her company does is to help businesses and individuals invest their money in causes that are important to them from a values point of view. Her company manages over $750 million in assets and even more under advisement, and essentially is funneling that capital into causes for good. Jen, could you talk a little bit about, how you came to create this business and why it was so important for you to activate this money in a more meaningful way?
Absolutely. So I'll give you the short version of how I got here. I worked during the day serving very wealthy families, institutions way back when. And then at night and on the weekends, I was working with the unhoused or the homeless population of Los Angeles. This goes way back to 2007, 8. And what I found is that we were working in a system that really was broken, that the systems of how local, state, and federal governments work together and how we invest capital and grant capital on a philanthropic perspective weren't actually working for society. And the more I dug into it, the more I saw a challenge that needed to be solved. And so I was doing that at nights and on the weekends, and my clients said, "What are you doing? You seem to have come alive." And so I started weaving this into my investment practice. And I started working with clients and families around what they cared about and why they cared about it and how they wanted to move into this arena. Impact investing was coined in 2007. And I think there's this misnomer out there. I'll just dispel a few right out of the gates and for the listeners. Is that it's philanthropic capital, but actually it's investment capital. We use all forms of capital to drive the change we want to see in the world, both from an economic development perspective as well as a climate perspective. And that you have to sacrifice returns in order to get, to make a difference or to leave the place better than we found it. And that's actually not true. There are investments that will underperform or maybe need an additional time frame to perform in line with traditional investments. But there are plenty of opportunities to look in the marketplace to find investments that perform in line with traditional investments that also take this additional approach of looking at how does it impact the environment socially and from a governance perspective. So that's how I ended up founding Align.
I love that. And some of the things that your investors are focusing on, I'm assuming we're talking about things like sustainable agriculture, affordable housing, climate change, which you already talked about, healthcare. Are there other categories that our listeners might not realize are places that you can invest to make a difference?
Pretty much anything that you see as an issue in society probably has an investment opportunity. I think the three things that come to mind that you didn't mention that are of importance, one is conservation. How do we conserve our resources? That could be anything from land conservation to the circular economy and reuse. Another one that comes to mind is how do we take the learnings from the indigenous population and how they built their communities, and how do we use those learnings and teachings to help them thrive because they're really underbanked and underinvested in, as well as have them inform us and how we live our lives. And then lastly, I think one of the most important is just how do we get capital in the hands of people that ultimately don't usually get to manage capital? Or how do we actually start to diversify who has the power around the capital? Because if we can invest in women, indigenous populations, people of color, veterans will actually be able to build a better capitalistic system that actually works for more people. And when you invest in those people, they usually invest in their employees and their communities. And so it has a rippling effect beyond just the investment itself.
I've heard incredible numbers around women, and when they even have small amounts of capital, the impact goes so much further than when it's in the hands of some other traditional types of capital allocation. So I don't know if you can speak to any of those numbers.
Well, the numbers have gone up and down since 2020, and partly that's because we had a huge rise in investing in women and what we would call BIPOC coming out of COVID and the George Floyd movement. And then if you look at the data over the last 12 to 18 months, it's actually going backwards. And so we're actually seeing the data isn't progressing as fast as we would like it to progress. And I think some of that is there's a lot of misnomers that these populations have to be able to jump through. What I mean by that is they get asked different questions in the fundraising process. If a woman comes into a room, and I happen to know this because I just had this conversation with a women-led company, they walk in and they say, I have a run rate revenue of X. Oftentimes the investor will discount it by 30% because usually males tend to sway the numbers, et cetera. And so what we're seeing is that women have to just go through different, I think the goalpost gets moved is how I like to say it. And they end up having to really continue to move towards the goalpost, but the goalpost keeps moving rather than leveling the playing field and actually saying like they do make good investment decisions. Women do lead companies effectively. They do tend to manage more conservatively. And if we look at all the data out there, the data would support that. And we just have to continue to break down some of our biases that have us continue to invest in ways that we've been investing for 50, 60, 100 years.
Yeah, I love that. And so when you do think about those measuring sticks that help you make decisions where your capital is being invested with Align, could you talk a little bit about how you measure things like environmental impact or social impact? What are the KPIs or measuring sticks when they're not as obvious as some of the financial ones that are easier to measure?
Really great question, and a question we've been tackling as an industry for 15 plus years. First, we'll start at the highest level, at the macro level. We're still really measuring metrics, and the metrics are different depending on the industry or on the company and what the company is actually doing. At Align, we have best practices, but we really lean on the companies and the funds to derive the metrics that they can easily track and get reliable data on, because those metrics should end up driving outcomes. And that's where we're ultimately trying to drive over a long period of time. Because we reduced food insecurity in this area, there is less malnourishment, better academic standards for children. They're thriving. You're seeing them grow at different rates, et cetera. Like those are because of. And so as we have more time under our belt, we'll be able to take the metrics and drive towards these metrics, derive the outcomes we're looking for as solutions.
And so when Align is making an investment in a fund or something like that, would that be an example of the type of things you're looking at investment by investment to decide if this is the right place to put your money?
At some level, yes. So most of what we do at Align is invest in funds. And then those funds invest in portfolio companies. And the funds, when we're underwriting them from three perspectives. One is financial, two is impact, and three is governance or operational risk. I'll focus on the impact since that's your question. And inside of the impact, we're actually looking at what is the problem they're trying to solve, right? So if we stay on food insecurity, we have something like 12 to 15% of our population doesn't have enough food in any given day. And so if we're trying to address that is a distribution problem as well as an access problem, as well as are we getting them the right food, healthy foods? Where's that food being sourced from, et cetera? What's the cost of that food? There's a whole complexity of things that have to go into that. But to keep it simple, we're looking at what is the problem? Is this a viable solution? And then how would we measure if we're actually tracking in the right direction? And so we look at various factors in the impact analysis to say, are we actually investing in something that has a really good shot of transforming the problem?
That's amazing. And so if we translate that to people who are listening today, who obviously are not, at the same level of investing as maybe the Align clientele would be. But nevertheless, for people who are like, we have a modest 401k, where like we've got some capital in our business that might not be allocated, it's sort of in the treasury. What kind of process or easy moves might you recommend for our listeners to try to align their values or their interests with their investments?
First, I'd start with knowing what you own currently. So you need to look at your actual holdings, whether that's direct companies, so public securities, stocks, or bonds, or mutual funds or ETFs, and know what's underneath those basket of securities. So just look at the top 10 holdings. You can do that on Yahoo Finance as one place. The second thing I would do is, once you know what you own, look in let's use your 401k as an example. You can then look to see, are there other options? There usually are from your 401k provider, where you can actually look at, do I want to invest in an ESG, environmental, sustainable, social governance strategy that is often going to look at certain externalities as well as the financial performance in order to qualify for that labeling. It's not a perfect labeling. We debate that all the time. But it at least is going to move you into a more green and just portfolio. And then another place that I think people often overlook is bonds. Bonds are a really great place to be investing in your communities. So if you have a bond portfolio, you might want to look to see if there is a mutual fund, an ETF, or an individual bond that is actually in your local municipality that might be funding a green initiative or redoing schools that haven't been redone in 40 years, which allows children to thrive in a better classroom environment, etc. There's usually a lot people can do in bonds. You just need to go beyond the normal things you look for, and you want to look at what's the use of proceeds. And then lastly, there are a tremendous amount of private investments if you are a accredited investor or qualified purchaser. That means you have some level of income and some level of academic or credentials to be able to invest in private companies. You can start to look at what are those companies doing and how do those strategies do more than just return or make money. How are they actually leaving society in a better place? So you do have a whole spectrum of capital in addition to investment capital. As I said earlier, you want to look at where you bank, what you consume. And then lastly, you always have your granting dollars, your philanthropic dollars. Those are the most crucial dollars. So I always say use those dollars to fund things that really have no other way to be funded and are really going to be helpful in an emergency situation or are going to really help that local community thrive. And without your dollars, it wouldn't be possible.
And those are the kind of dollars that you're not demanding a certain amount of return or a certain time frame for those dollars to activate. It's just doing what you think is right and voting with your dollar, so to speak. Just, this is important to me.
Voting, and also you're usually doing it some reasons for tax deduction. And so you can really use those dollars to go pretty far for the local community.
That sounds like a ton of research, just to be completely honest. So if you work with an advisor, is there like a cheat sheet? Is there some website? Is there some resource that is just easily available that can, help somebody navigate this world?
I am sure there is plenty of websites, but if you work with an advisor, ask your advisor, what do I own? I'd love to know what's underneath my equity portfolio or my bond portfolio. What other options do I have? Right? Ask the questions. Ask what you care about. If there's a company that your values really don't align with, say, I really don't want to be invested in this company and for these reasons. And I'd love for you to make sure that I don't actually own this in some other fund that I'm not aware of. That's why you have an advisor. The point of the advisor is so that they can do that work and they can actually empower you around your money rather than have you be in the dark.
Well, I love the advice to be a more active participant in how your dollars are actually being, put to work out into the world, because I don't know, obviously not you, but me, I definitely give my advisor a lot of control. And I'm not asking as many layered questions about what's underneath. We're really talking about financial returns and expectations, but I I will say for myself, I haven't asked those questions of like, I'd like to better understand exactly, who's using this capital and for what purpose. So that's really good advice and something that I will definitely put to work. I'm sure our listeners will want to do that as well.
Maybe to simplify it, take the ticker symbol. So the ticker symbol is really how everything's identified. And then you can put that in the search function, and usually it'll come up with like a lot of the key holdings, scorings, etc. And that's also, it's very common that you would ask your advisor, hey, what is under the all country world index? What do I actually own? And then I always find that it's helpful if you know what you don't want to own. So I don't want to be invested in private prisons. I don't want to be invested in tobacco, factory farming, certain things that I believe we just don't need to continue to do to
Those
generate
are great examples.
returns.
Those ESG entities that you were talking about, are there like bonds have ratings? Do those also have a scorecard, or is there a universal rating system for those types of investments?
MSCI has a rating system for traditional funds or stocks as well as for ESG. ESG is just, they also, beyond the financial returns, are looking at environmental, social, and governance factors. And so they tend to get a scoring around those factors.
Got it. So that's important too. I think there's just a lot to learn in this category so that you make good decisions, but this is a great place to start and at a minimum have the conversation with your advisor.
Absolutely.
Good advice, Jen. Thank you. Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is that, if we actually take a moment to be a little bit more intentional with things that we might be taking for granted, that is a place where we can align our own impact in a more meaningful way. And it does sound like there's a little bit of legwork that has to happen. But one of the things that you said that struck a note with me is, I've never even really given a lot of thought to local banks until we were in COVID and had like the entire PPP situation. And at that time, I really recognized the value of having a personal banking relationship with someone in my own community, which luckily I did have with First Bank. But I think that that's something that in general is something that we could activate easily and, actually put our capital to work for us in our own community, which is, I think, really a lovely idea and hopefully something that our listeners will consider. Another thing that I think about with the people who are listening who either like are founders of businesses or CEOs and have the ability to make decisions is, Align Impact is a certified B Corporation. I always find this to be such a fascinating conversation with people that make an investment in something like that because it's quite expensive and there's a lot of rigor around it. Could you speak to why it was so important for Align to make that decision? And if you have any ideas about other types of maybe even more bite-sized actions that our, listeners could take in their own business just to align their business protocols and operations with the values that they have or the things that are most important to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we knew we were always going to be a B Corp because we're in this space and this is what we do day in and day out. But I think the things that drive us to continue to be a B Corp is really three things. One is that we do take a multi-stakeholder approach. Yes, we're fiduciaries, we're investors, we're investing on behalf of our investors. And so we're looking at it from their perspective. Call them our clients. We're also looking at it from where do we source and supply and our people. Our people are our largest investment because we're a people business. And so how we take care of our people is really important. And that's one of the things around B Corp is not just your governance structure, but also how do you treat your internal employees as well as your contractors? Are you sourcing from a diverse contract base? Are you looking at the environmental impacts across your business units? And yes, to your point, it is cumbersome. I think the reason I like it so much is it actually holds you accountable. It gives you places that you can aspire to get to, that you can grow into as your business grows. I'd say the pieces that I think you can do that maybe are a little lower hanging fruit. One is like, how do you take care of your people? Are you growing your business so that your people are growing their wealth as well? And are you coming up with ways to transfer ownership and have your employees be owners in the business down the road or in the future? That's one. I love the B Corp movement because we really try to take care of our people. That's number one. Number two is so look at models to transition ownership or to allow others to grow wealth alongside the founders and the original investors. Number two is just looking at your environmental footprint. It's actually really good to know kind of what is your baseline? Where are you starting? I, as you know, live on airplanes and we look at, how much time am I spending? What should the carbon footprint be? What's the rest of our footprint? How do we offset that with projects that are going to drive positive returns back to society? So there are ways that you can just be a little bit more mindful in your uses that then I think work better for the rest of us. And then lastly, I just think you have to ultimately say, are you driving towards just one bottom line, which is profits? Or are you actually driving towards double, triple bottom line? And ultimately, what are you driving towards? And I think a lot of times people focus on profit, which is super important, but also what are the externalities that we're not pricing in? And how do those externalities actually affect us down the road?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea when you're thinking about expanding your evaluations into other categories than profit, and certainly even looking at things like who your vendors are, who your partners are. I mean, when you look at your business holistically, I think you can find places where you may be making an impact you don't mean to be making.
Mm-hmm. We call that a negative externality that you're not even aware of.
Wow. That's a $10 word, Jen. One of the things that you do that I think is really interesting is you are the outgoing president of EO, which is Entrepreneurs Organization in Colorado, which is an international organization that works with business owners. So in that role, could you share a little bit about how you have influenced, hopefully, some of the people in Colorado to think about leading their businesses, leading their teams, and growing themselves? I'd love to hear a little bit about that from you.
Absolutely. I think I'd start maybe at the top of we did our first impact event a couple of years ago as I was kind of spearheading into this role. You actually become president like 2.5 years before you serve. And so you start to kind of make your mark, and we felt like adding an impact lens into our kind of the curriculum that we give to our members was super important, like really educating them on the B Corp movement and how they could or could not do it and what resources are out there and consultants, and having it become more tangible rather than just a great idea. Another, EO, as you said, is a global network of almost 20,000 entrepreneurs. Like, we actually have the power of the collective and of capital. And we in Colorado have the power of all coming together to really drive resources for our own individual businesses and the collective. And I think oftentimes we go about everything in this world almost individually when we're so much more powerful together. I think the other thing is just education, right? Education around what options are out there to most of our conversation here today. And then how do people start to weave those into their business? We have, I think, probably we have a dozen probably B Corps in the EO Colorado community. And then from there, you're starting to see those companies actually lead on a national stage beyond the EO world, right? And I think that's super important because I think the more you have people that drive this together in a collective way, the easier it is for people to follow along rather than, oh, that's something they do over there, and I don't know how to do that with my business. I'd say the last thing, because you kind of wove it into your question, is, we really have focused over the last 2 years on businesses that are building communities of employees. Like, we're not sole entrepreneurs in EO. We're actually entrepreneurs with 1099 contractors and or employees. And we're working through, like, how do we become a better leader? How do we build better standard operating procedures? How do we grow our businesses without burning ourselves out? How do we grow our businesses without the expense being at the customer level. And so that's part of what I think that community has done over the last few years and will continue to do.
When you think about your role in EO, and I know it's, as you said, it starts many years before you're actually the president. And now I believe you're at the very final, maybe is this the last day?
Yes, it is.
Last day. So we're here to celebrate your accomplishments as president, outgoing president. So what were the leadership lessons, maybe that surprised you from your tenure in EO, and how do those maybe influence the decisions that you can take into Align in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say the first thing that comes to mind is you really do have to be a servant leader. People talk about servant leadership and like giving, even when you're not getting as much in return, a lot. This is a good example. Like I often remind people, I'm a volunteer, just like you. I'm a member, just like you. But I believe in the power of entrepreneurs. Like we create value, we drive innovation, we create huge amount of jobs in society. And so I do believe it starts with entrepreneurs and founders and visionaries. And so for me, that is probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned is when I'm going to say yes to something, am I deeply committed to it? And would I do it as a servant leader? The second thing is when you're leading your peers, it's different than when you're leading your company. They're your peers. They don't work for you. They're not driving the same results as you. They come and go, they give and take, they complain, whatever. They're still your peers. And there's a difference in leadership when you're leading your peers. And then lastly, I'm just not the same leader I was 3 to 5 years ago, even in my own company. Right? Because I've learned so much about what does it take to scale a business, to institutionalize it, to grow it beyond me, right? To really have it stand on its own. That's really come out of being around other entrepreneurs who have done it, who have come before, who have had the exits, who have shared the war stories that really have inspired me to look at my own leadership and kind of what is my authentic, natural leadership style, and how is that going to evolve as the company evolves and as I evolve as an individual inside of the company and as an individual outside the company.
Right. It's a beautiful growth experience, I guess, is what I'm hearing you say. And it certainly comes with challenges. But when you think about how those lessons will shape your next 3 to 5 years as a leader, as Jennifer Kenning, what do you think is most important for you to sort of take away and own as part of your own brand, like brand Jen?
I think one thing that was really profound in the early days that maybe is less as you kind of move up the ladder is just like authenticity and just like why you care about something. In the early days of Align, I used to go into the field and I used to like work with the portfolio companies on the ground. And it really informed a lot of the solutions-based thinking and what investments we should and shouldn't make. And I think coming out of the other side of this is like almost going back to that, like what inspires me, what gets me out of bed. That's different today than it was 5 years ago or even 10 or 15 years ago. The core mission that the world works for 8 billion people on the planet is still the same. But how we get there isn't really a straight line. It ebbs and flows. We get off track. I think, coming out of this experience of EO and also transitioning the company from where it was 5 years ago to where it is today, it's really me looking back and it's also looking forward to say my role is different, right? My role is less in the business. I work on the business, not in the business. And I'm continuing to set the vision. What does our world look like in 2030 and 2040 with AI and continued challenging moments that we're facing today around people and planet? And the solutions today are different than they would have been 5 years ago.
Of course, and that the rate of change is so wild and shifting literally under our feet. It's a huge challenge, and I'm glad that there are people like you that are in the positions of authority and influence that you have in order to help lead us to a future that does have, more equity for all and more opportunity to have a say in the power dynamics of what happens in our world. One of the things that I love about the Align Substack is that it's called Hopeful Pioneers. That's a beautiful name. Could you talk about, is that something, a name you coined, or where did that come from and what does it mean to you?
Great question. So we actually rebranded the company last year. We wanted to, at our 10-year anniversary, we wanted to really take a step back and to look forward. So really have our past inform us, but really what does the future look like and what company do we need to be and who do we need to be in order to really help wealth holders drive a different system? And to a word I like a lot is scorecard, like the scoreboard. What does the scoreboard ultimately tell us? And we came up with the Hopeful Pioneer because as we interviewed our clients and other people in the industry, what we found is that these people are willing to go first. They're willing to go where no one else has gone. They're willing to challenge the status quo of a system, of society, in a lot of cases of their family. These are inheritors. These are first-time entrepreneurs that generated extraordinary wealth that are going to use their money differently than maybe their parents or grandparents. These are people that have power and access as well as capital, and they're willing to speak up. They're not going to sit on the sidelines. They're not going to shift language because of where we are in society. They're not going to take the short road. They're going to take the long approach. We're investing in businesses today that we won't see those investments pay off financially or from an impact perspective for 5, 7 to 15 to 20 years from now. Like what we do today impacts 20, 30 and beyond. And we know that as long-term investors, but the hopeful pioneers are willing to take the long game because they actually want it to be different for their children and their children's children. And they actually see more than just, let me accumulate wealth and give it away. It's actually like, well, let's do both of them simultaneously and let's use other tools like engagement, where we bank, etc., what we consume as part of the movement to drive us having a different outcome.
How do you find, when you're thinking about, you are a hopeful pioneer, how do you find the energy in the face of all of the opportunity? There are a lot of things that I'm sure that you can support. And I know that the research and the diligence is really intense. How do you find like the energy and optimism to do this work day in and day out? And how do you maintain your like hopeful status? What are your practices that you could share with us?
It's a great question. It's not always easy. I think I struggled with severe depression in my 20s. And so coming out of that, I learned that I needed something bigger than just the normal. I needed to be grounded in purpose and mission. So I really try to look and reflect upon that a lot. When I'm straying off course or I feel kind of lost, I go back to like, what's my purpose? What's my mission? What am I focused on? What do I care about? What keeps me up at night? What infuriates me about certain things? And then what are the solutions? Like, I like puzzles. I like to solve puzzles. I like to problem solve. And so I think that keeps me engaged, right? Because while there are so many things in society right now that don't work and that could have us lack hope, there is actually a lot we are hopeful for. One is we have a next generation that is willing to speak up, that does want things differently, like that is learning different things than we learned when we were educated 20, 30 years ago. They're going to transform it faster because of technology, right? We are moving faster than ever, but we're a connected global community. Think about us trying to do something globally even 10 years ago. It was pretty hard. Today, it's easy. We can do it overnight, from currency to due diligence to interactive meetings. Like that all changed really much in 2020. So for me, there's 3 things one is purpose. And purpose may change. It may evolve, right? 2 is what are the practices in my life that keep me grounded? As you know, I'm an avid meditator and I spend the first hour of my day for myself. That was pretty transformative as an entrepreneur. I used to wake up and New York's 2 hours ahead or 3 hours if I'm in Los Angeles. And what does everyone need? What do I need to do today? What's happening? And now I'm like, I wake up and I'm focused on Jen and what does Jen need to be the best leader and best version of herself? And then lastly is, making sure that it's represented in my life. I need more than just a company. I need EO and communities that challenge my thinking and bring up new topics that I wouldn't otherwise discover. I need travel so that I can be grounded in, how great we have it here, even if it seems like it's gloomy. And so some of those reminders and just having those things in my life really do instill me to have the hopeful, optimist, like future that we are trying to build, and that every day seems to be derailing, but there is, inside of the derailment is another opportunity for growth.
Right. When you think about, the evidence, if you could think ahead and put yourself in a future state and you're looking for a year from now or 3 years from now or 5 years from now, is there some kind of measurement that for you personally that would make you feel like you've done something really important, that the impact is there? Could you share, or would you be willing to share what that might be for you?
Yeah, I think 1 year might be too short of a time horizon, since I think in decades, but I'll go 5 years out because I'll be 50 at that point. So it's a good milestone, in 2030. It's a good milestone as well. I would really like that we're transition leadership at Align, and the next generation of leaders are fully running it and they're starting to transition into the ownership of it. Cause I do think that is one of my core values, is transitioning ownership and wealth and having people step into whatever's next for the company. Personally, I want to be continuing to work on global problems, but at a much larger scale. I want to look at how do we do it in across geographies, $1 billion, like things that really move the needle, not one deal at a time. But what is the systems, or what do the systems need in order to thrive in a new economy? And I'm sure that it'll look completely different than it looks right now, if I just think of where we were 5 years ago. And then, I'd love to be mentoring more founders. And so I would need to have a little bit more time than I currently do. I'd love to be like a sounding board and a place for them to feel like they could ask anything that's really keeping them up at night and get an unbiased answer that's more questions than an answer, so that they figure it out for themselves, but they don't feel like they have to go it alone.
And I know advice isn't your thing, but if you could sort of whisper a piece of advice to a values-led founder, that would just kind of help them create a meaningful business, or even create greater meaning in the business they already have, what would that advice be?
I'm going to give you two. One is, look at your own unique place in the world and come up with the values that work for you and your business. You don't need to take someone else's values. Look at your core values and how do you make those actionable beyond profits? Right? One of our core values is we partner generously. I think if you know me well, you know that I do that everywhere in my life. If you meet any of our employees, they do that. So partnering generously is way different than generosity. Like, it's actionable. So I would say, look at your company and make something actionable that really speaks to you, because then it will stand the test of time. And if it speaks to you, it probably speaks to millions of other people. And then my favorite quote, which I will use in this question here because I think it's appropriate. I think everyone's really focused on going fast. Like, the world is moving fast. The weeks move fast. The days move fast. And one of my favorite quotes is an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. It's in the collective. Find your people, find your community, and go with them, because you'll be able to go much farther for much longer and have much more endurance in doing so, in my opinion.
Well, that is a beautiful place for us to stop. I think you shared a lot of valuable information. Is there anything that you would like to add?
One thing, look at where your money sleeps at night and just be empowered by it, rather than not knowing what that institution is focused on and where they're investing your capital.
I think there's a lot of people who will listen to this episode and go start Googling their banks and start lifting up the corners to see what's actually happening with their money. It's an incredibly powerful thing that to activate the capital that we have, whether you're an institutional, investor, or you're a family office, or you're, the president of $1 million company. You do have a lot of power. And I think, Jen, you've shared some really valuable advice for how we can put that money to work in new ways and think differently about the decisions that we make. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for your work.
Thanks for watching The Conscious Entrepreneur. If something landed for you, will you leave a comment? I'd love to hear what you thought. And if you haven't done it yet, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much, and I'll meet you here next week.